As I was thinking about today is all about throwing a tantrum. And I don't know if you have ever been in a place where you have ever witnessed a young child throwing a tantrum. Many years ago, when my son was a lot younger, I used to coach his football team, which was, I guess, as the coach, my football team. And the average age of the team was about 6 years old. And this was a really weird team because what made this football team so strange was that over half the people in the team wanted to be the goalie, right? Really weird dynamic in a football team. But what that led to was tantrums. And so when I was trying to figure out how to rotate these boys through being the goalie, often on Saturday mornings when our time would start, I would have to navigate my way through a number of tantrums because some of the boys wanted to be the goalie more than anything. And I remember one particular Saturday morning, there was one of the boys who was a right character. When it wasn't his turn to be the goalie, the game had started, he came over and he had grabbed my foot and was lying on the ground throwing a tantrum because he wanted to be the goalie, and all the parents and everything were watching, like a strange thing, right? But it's a bit like, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever been in the supermarket and you'll see a mum. It's funny, with what I've seen, it's always tended to be a mum, but you've got a mum and a child, and the mum has obviously said to the child, no, you can't have something, and then the child becomes incredibly expressive. I remember I was in Howick Countdown many years ago, and I saw a young child start to grab cans off the bottom shelf and start throwing the cans, And I don't know if you've ever seen anything like that, but when you do, the first thing that happens is your heart goes out to the mum, right? The second thing that happens is, I don't know if you noticed, but there tends to be a lot of awkwardness from others trying to figure out what they should do. And in the worst case, when mum picks up the child to leave and the child starts screaming, and when they leave and you see the discussions that then start to go on with people, right? And more often than not, in that situation, people around don't offer help because they're kind of awkward. It's an awkward thing, right? So you feel sorry for the mum. The child is throwing a tantrum, but sometimes you just don't know what to do. Now, it's interesting that this is how the story of Jonah ends. Jonah, the mighty prophet of God, throws a tantrum. You can almost imagine, I don't know if you've ever seen the VeggieTales movie about Jonah, but they have this amazing shot where you've got this mighty prophet of God who's throwing a tantrum, and you've got all the Ninevites in the city who have now repented, who are looking out at this guy on the hill throwing a tantrum, and they're all going, what's up with that guy? So it's weird. The book of Jonah ends in a very weird way. However, I think the weirdness of it adds to its authenticity. And I was thinking about it this week, that, like if you were to write a story, well, I know some of us in the room have, but if you write a story, you tend to start with, or there's a pattern. You have a character that gets introduced. There's a crisis of some kind, right? Then the crisis kind of escalates, and then it tends to get resolved. And a lot of stories or movies that you watch, unless it's been set up for a sequel, tends to have some kind of resolution to the story. What we would call maybe a happy ending, right? But in the book of Jonah, we meet a guy who has a crisis. He runs. God pulls him back on track. Then he goes to Nineveh. He preaches, and people repent. Now, if the book of Jonah ended at chapter 3, that would be a nice story. But it doesn't. It ends with a prophet of God throwing his toys. Now, when I read it and when I understand that, I can't help but have that emotion again of that small boy holding my foot or seeing that mum in the supermarket. That's actually kind of how I feel a little bit when I read the end of the Book of Jonah. It's horrible, it's embarrassing, and the story is unresolved. And ironically, that's another reason as to why I think the Book of Jonah is a genuine account, because no one would make up a story like that. Now, the caution for us is that we might laugh at Jonah, but when you look at it more carefully, Jonah could be a picture of you and I. Now, archaeology, here we go. When Jonah died, according to various traditions, he was buried in, and you're all going to smile, one of 5 places. And I figure that, he was probably buried in one of those 5 places, but, But the most reputable burial site was at a place that became the Nabi Yunus Mosque in Iraq. And in the Muslim world, Jonah, or Yunus, is a prophet that they have also claimed for themselves. And when the early Muslims found the site of Jonah's tomb in the ancient city of Nineveh around 750 years after Christ, they built one of their early mosques on top of it. Now, lovely picture there we put up on the screen. In 2014, ISIS captured the Nabi Yunus Mosque and blew it up. And you can Google it and watch the explosion now. Google's amazing like that, right? But for those of you who may remember, ISIS had a policy of destroying anything that in their understanding was a form of false worship. So anything to do with idols, anything like that, they went through and they just had this big field day and blowing all of these things up. And so what had happened, the reason that they blew up this particular mosque, which was an unusual thing for ISIS to do, but the reason they did that was because they felt it was becoming a shrine that Muslims were traveling to revisit the bones of this famous prophet. Now, out of the rubble of this explosion, and after ISIS moved on, archaeologists for the first time were then allowed to look under the site. Because it had been a mosque, right, they weren't allowed to do it, but because the mosque had been removed, they were allowed to go and have a closer look. And what they found was that this mosque had actually been built on top of a palace of an ancient Assyrian king by the name of Sennacherib. And this photo here was from old CNN footage. Now, it seems that Sennacherib had made arrangements to protect the body of Jonah long after Sennacherib died. The irony of it is that archaeologists would never have known this unless the ISIS extremists hadn't blown the mosque up. Now, the reason I raise that this morning is I find it interesting that we have an ancient Assyrian king who was very well known in history, making arrangements to protect the body of a Jewish prophet to Nineveh as a historical fact. And I find that incredibly interesting. Now, so I think there's a lot of weight to the account of Jonah, more than we realize. Now, I have another observation about Jonah before we look at the text. When we study the big picture of Scripture, we see that the nation of Israel was given a mission by God. And Israel was meant to be a blessing to the nations, meaning that they were meant to be a blessing to all people groups outside themselves. And a question that I have for us all this morning is, did they succeed? And the answer to that question is no. In fact, they failed miserably. In fact, they failed so badly that when the promised Messiah turns up, Jesus of Nazareth, they even reject him. And because of this, the scriptures tell us that God scattered the Jews throughout the whole world. That's a rabbit hole. We're not going down there. But a number of theologians have come up with a theory about the Book of Jonah, and it's this. They have this idea that Jonah is representative of the nation of Israel historically. Jonah was so convinced that he was God's chosen and that God was going to judge all of the other nations that when God does forgive Nineveh, Jonah is so distressed by this that he throws a tantrum. God had let him down. God wasn't doing things Jonah's way. So Jonah had this preconceived idea about the grace and mercy of God. In Jonah's mind, he was in the favor of God, and everyone else who was not Jewish was out. Many of our Jewish friends still believe this today. So that's the first part of the theory. But the second part of the theory is that Nineveh is representative of all Gentile history. In other words, all non-Jewish history since the cross. And many Gentiles today, many non-Jews, believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I think there's a few of us in this room this morning that believe wholeheartedly that Jesus is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the promised Messiah to come. And this is why the mercy of God is unfathomable for many Jews. Now, the danger for us, however, is that we too have to be careful, because we might fall into the same trap of believing that God is on our side at the expense of other people. It's human nature. So Jonah was called the first time, right? In chapter 1. Did he complete his task? The answer to that call was no, he did not. But then Jonah was called a second time at the beginning of chapter 3. Did he do it? The answer is yes, he did. He was successful. Now, Israel was called once. Did Israel succeed? The answer is no. She rejected the Messiah when he arrived. But I just want to put it out there that I believe that the second time is underway. We are seeing the beginning of it. And Ezekiel 36 talks about the second phase of Israel's calling, starting when she was gathered together as a nation back in 1948. Now, we don't have time to get into that this morning, but I would like to encourage all of you to do some research into the prophetic timeline and Israel's role in prophecy. But we're not going to go down that track, or we'll be here for 2 or 3 days. Right. But anyway, let's look at the text. Chapter 4 is a strange chapter. It's about a plant, it's about a worm, and it's about an east wind. Now, right up to the point, this point in the story, we can kind of relate to it, right? It's got drama, it's got action, it's got adventure and excitement, it's got missions. And the biggest miracle in the book had just happened. Hundreds of thousands of people repented before God and got into a right relationship with him. Friends, that is one incredible altar call, right? How amazing is that? We can imagine what that would look like in the Salvation Army SAMIS system. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So anyway, Jonah Chapter 4. On Jonah Chapter 4, there's a title, Jonah's Anger at the Lord's Compassion. And thank you, Ansu, for reading that to us this morning. But verse 1, but to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. Now, verse 1 begins with the word but, right? What he's reacting to is the fact that people have come to God and God has forgiven them, right? Now look at this prophet's reaction. But to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. Now, as I mentioned before, we can all smile and laugh at Jonah, but we need to be very, very careful. What's the old saying? There but for the grace of God go you and I. Whatever is bothering Jonah is potentially some kind of manifestation of what could be bothering you and me. So not just him. So friends, we need to be cautious. The text continues, verse 2, he prayed to the Lord. Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. That is weird, right? In other words, Jonah was saying, Lord, I knew that if I obeyed you, then they were going to be forgiven. We can't have that. And what was his reaction? Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. Tantrum. What a weird response. But as I was reading with this and thinking about maybe some of the prejudices I carry, oh my goodness, could this be a picture of me? You know, it's all right, for our family and our friends and our whānau to be right with God, and we love it when that happens. But not that weird person down the street. You know what I mean? There's something about our human nature that is so incredibly broken. But notice how God answers Jonah in verse 4. But the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? Notice God gives Jonah a very graceful response. He doesn't rebuke him or scold him. God is patient, he is gracious, he is loving, and he is kind. And he's no less to Jonah. See, this is where God's mercy, I think, sometimes is unfathomable for us. Verse 5, Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. So he's just throwing a bit of a tantrum, the warm-up to the tantrum, actually. And now he's wandering out. East is significant, by the way. Any time that someone moves east in the scripture, it tends to be that they're moving away from God. All right? But Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. See, the implication is that the 40 days isn't over yet. And it's almost as if he's getting his popcorn ready, right? Getting his popcorn, sitting on the edge of the city. He's waiting for that entertainment that in his mind is about to happen. A front seat to the judgment of God on these wicked people. In Jonah's mind, the Ninevites are going to get what's coming to them. I don't know if you and I have ever thought about like that with people. But look what God does next in verse 6. Then the Lord provided a leafy plant. Or if you've got the King James Version here this morning, it says that the Lord provided a gourd. And made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. There's a lesson here about personal comfort. Jonah got comfortable. I think that's a huge challenge for us, because we live in a day and age where comfort is the be-all and end-all, right? Think about the hours that we might watch TV or the hours that we do things that it's all about our personal pleasure. But friends, I'm not slamming that. What I'm just saying is that we always have to remember that the mission that we are called to, the desire for that mission, I think, sometimes needs to outweigh the desire for our own personal pleasures. Now, scholars think that according to the language, this may have been a Palma Christi, which is like a castor bean plant. And it's a plant indigenous to the area, and it grows very, very quickly and has large leaves. God probably used it and made it grow quicker than it normally would, right? And it's also very vulnerable to worms. And because of this, it can die as quickly as it grows. Verse 7, but at dawn the next day, God provided a worm. And by the way, that word, I came across some debate this week. It could be plural. So it might have been more than one worm. It could be worms, right? But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind. So there's some things going on here. The plant grows, worms eat it, and then the east wind arrives. And look what the impact of the wind. And the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die. And once again, right? Tantrum. It would be better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Now notice, if you look back in verse 4, God also asked Jonah a question that Jonah never answered. What was Jonah angry about? He was angry about the salvation of Nineveh. Then in his anger, he goes up a hill, he sits down, the plant grows, it dies, the wind arrives, and then Jonah gets even angrier. But God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? What does Jonah say to God? It is, he says. And I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. Tantrum. But the Lord said, you've been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and it died overnight. And then the famous last verse of the book. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also so many animals? The end. That's weird. So Jonah throws a tantrum, God speaks, and the book ends. But when we look at chapter 4 closely, I believe that the plant and the worm illustrate a point. Had Jonah made the plant grow? No. Had he contributed to it? No. Had God saved Jonah? Yes. For all of his faults, Jonah was God's man of the moment. But what God is saying here is this: if I have saved you, Jonah, then why shouldn't I save them? You are more concerned about your own comfort than the 120,000 people who cannot tell their left hand from their right. Now, we know that the population of Nineveh, by the way, was more than 120,000 people. But it's interesting that in the ancient world, this idea of people not being able to tell their left hand from their right often referred to young people. See, I find that interesting. So, was God doing it for the kids? Don't know. Now, as I was thinking about this, I had a couple of thoughts. The first one is about our comfort, our personal comfort. Friends, I just want to put it out there before us this morning that in New Zealand, yes, we have day-to-day problems and we have issues. But I tell you what, for most of us who live in this amazing country, God's own place, is that I genuinely believe that sometimes the things that we pursue in life do get in the way of a calling that God has for us. And that can be uncomfortable to hear. And look, that applies to me as well. I think sometimes we get so comfortable in our lifestyles that we forget about the fact that we have a lot of people who are hurting around us, right? And so I think that's the first thing. Jonah was rebuked by God, in one sense, for being more concerned about his personal comfort than for those rotten, stinking people that he's just forgiven down the hill, okay? But then I think as Christ followers, sometimes the danger is that we wish that judgment and destruction would come upon people we consider to be very sinful, whose wickedness seems to demand immediate punishment. And our friends, especially if you go online and you look at what happens in the USA, in the evangelical world there, and you see the types of protests that go on, you can have, 3 or 4 different versions of people being upset all at the one protest, all coming from different churches. And that distresses me. See, God is more merciful than we can imagine. As I said, his mercy is unfathomable. God feels compassion for those that some people want judged. See, God would rather have them brought to himself. What is our attitude towards those who we disagree with? And I'm not talking about the public face we put out there. What's going on in our hearts? Would we rather that God destroy them, reinforcing the idea that we are right? See, this can be a bit of a hard word this morning, right? Or do we wish that they too could experience God's mercy and forgiveness? You see, Jonah Chapter 4, the reason I believe that Jonah Chapter 4 is there is because it confronts us with our own sinful nature. The second thought I had is this. Jonah was angry at the withering of the plant, but not over what happened to Nineveh. You see, I don't know about you guys, or I'll put it this way, some of us have wept over the death of a pet, right? Or some sentimental object has been broken that's really upset us. And we might have cried over those things. But how easy is it to be more sensitive to our own interests than to the urgent spiritual needs of people around us? It's kind of an uncomfortable word. But I think, if we immerse ourselves in thinking about that, this is the thing that pulls us back on track, right? And I believe, friends, that we're all in this room this morning. God knew that we were going to be here today. We're in a Salvation Army hall. The thing about the Salvation Army is that, yes, we look after, we love, we care for each other, but our mission has always been bigger than just us. And as we're coming up to our 30th birthday next year, I'm going, okay, what has been that 30-year legacy? Because there's been some really good stuff that's happened in that space. But have we got it right all of the time? And I'm not sure that we have all of the time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the worship team forward. And as we enter into our response time this morning, and as we look at Jonah, we need to remember the following things. So here we go. It's also a little bit like a recap, right? In chapter 1, God spared the sailors. They called out to him and they were saved. Then in chapter 2, God saved Jonah. What did Jonah do? Jonah called out to God from the belly of the whale, belly of the big fish, sorry, and was saved. And as I said before, like when Jonah was in the belly of the big fish, all of the digestive juices would have been at work. This was not a comfortable place to be. Sometimes when we call out to God, by the way, the danger is that we expect some kind of emotional rush. But actually the truth of the matter is a lot of the times when we call out to God, when we're in distress, it's uncomfortable. But then in chapter 3, we see that God saved the people of Nineveh when they responded to Jonah's preaching. So God answered the prayers of everybody who reached out to him. Right? Pagan sailors from another idolatrous nation, they got saved. Jonah, God's man of the moment, was in the belly of the fish, called out to God. He needed a bit of course correction, but God helped him. Then Ninevites, nasty, wicked people, into human sacrifice, into all sorts of things. They were known for their violence. But they called out to God and God saved them. And it's interesting, when we go back to that archaeology, is that the only reason that a person gets venerated like that in the ancient world was because they made an impact in their time. My hunch is that Nineveh had a spiritual revival. They had a revival. So God answers the prayers of everyone who calls on him, including you and me this morning in this room. God will always work his will, and he desires that all will come to him, trust in him, and be saved. So friends, we can be saved if we heed God's warnings to us through his word. The Book of Jonah assures us that if we respond in obedience, God will be gracious and we will receive his unfathomable mercy. We won't receive his punishment, even if we end up throwing a tantrum. Why do people throw tantrums? Because they've either been challenged or something's uncomfortable.